Good morning, and thank you for attending our annual Advocacy 101 for Foundations. We do this every year, so be mindful of that in the future as you have new colleagues join your organizations, and let us know in the meantime if there's any questions we can answer. We're joined today by a really wonderful panel of experts from Illinois and the national level. I'm really grateful for their assistance today. And we understand right now folks are feeling extremely anxious about a lot of things that are happening at the federal and state level. And so we just want to acknowledge that and convey that we're here to support you all and that we're all trying to work together to manage the current situation. There are heightened efforts now to investigate and regulate the nonprofit sector. And so being aware of the rules in the advocacy space is really more important than ever. And we also would encourage you to consider how we can support your fellow staff and volunteers that maybe aren't in the room today. So let us know if there's anything we could do that in the future. One of the things we'll cover today is things you're not allowed to do, in addition to things you are allowed to do. So we just want to make sure folks feel equipped to engage without violating the rules and encourage you to engage. Nothing we do today is intended to discourage you from participating in our democratic process. So I'm going to take a moment to introduce our panel, and then we're going to hand it off to them and dive right in. So first, in alphabetical order, Carrie Davis uses she, they pronouns and is the director of the democracy program at the Joyce Foundation, where she leads the foundation's work to protect and improve policies on voting rights and voting access, election administration best practices, fair representation and redistricting, and promoting a more equitable US Census. Carrie also co-leads a pilot project addressing the rise of political violence and its harmful impact on functional democracy. Next, we have from the national level, Matthew L. Evans, who was newly appointed as the forum's VP of Advocacy and External Relations. That's a promotion for him. Congratulations, Matthew. Matthew brings to the forum more than 15 years of public policy and government relations experience, and has been instrumental in the forum's expansion of its public policy work. Throughout his time in philanthropy, Matthew has served on the public policy committees of the Forum, Independent Sector, and Council on Foundations. Currently, he's also the vice chair of Nonprofit Vote Board of Directors. Next, we have Maggie Heine. Maggie is the Associate General Counsel at MacArthur Foundation here in Illinois. Prior to that, she served as Associate Attorney at Ropes and Gray LLP, where she worked in the Tax, Employment, and Benefits Practice Group. Maggie is a member of Forefront's Policy Committee, and we're so happy to have her join us today. Finally, we have Jessica Mendieta. Jessica joined the National Council of Nonprofits in September 2021 as a policy associate. In this role, Jessica researches and develops educational content about policies that affect the nationwide network. Her experience in the nonprofit and government sectors, as well as her background in data analysis and visualization, led her to find opportunities to show trends and policies that impact organizations and communities. And Jessica is a part of the organization that has been working very hard to support nonprofits in light of the executive orders, and National Council of Nonprofits was party to the lawsuit that blocked the funding freeze. So has been a really key player lately. So with that, I'm gonna just show the snapshot of the agenda so you have a feel for where we're headed. We're gonna try to transition to the FOTH training by 10:30. So we'll have 1 hour spent on the Advocacy 101, and then we'll spend 30 minutes on the FOTH portions. So those of you that aren't going to FOTH might want to step out at that point, but you're welcome to stay if you'd like to learn more about what we do at FOTH, because you might be considering participating in the future. So please feel free to stick around for that. So before we dive in, I want to ask Emily to launch a couple polls, which will help our panel know who's in the room and what level of expertise you're bringing. These are anonymous, so please don't hesitate to answer honestly. We have 3 questions. We'll start with this just to get a snapshot of what types of foundations are with us today. So what type of foundation, and we're checking on number 2, just your basic understanding of the rules. And then lastly, your basic understanding of how involved you are in funding advocacy and policy work. As a reminder, this is anonymous, so no one's coming to get you. So it looks like most folks have answered. We've got primarily other types of foundations. If folks that checked other are willing to pop in chat what kind of foundation you're coming from, or we may have some folks in the room that are not foundations, which is fine. And feel free to use chat to introduce yourselves. So it looks like most folks understand the amount of lobbying you do depends on what type of foundation you are. We're going to dig in though for the benefit of others. That's why we're here today. And then it looks like we have a decent level of interest in funding advocacy and policy work in the future. That's really nice to hear. And we're going to help equip you to do that. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Thank you for participating. And here's the results for those that didn't see it yet. So quickly, I'm going to review Forefront and just remind folks why Forefront is in this space. So Forefront is both the philanthropy serving organization and the nonprofit alliance in Illinois. PSO's philanthropy serving organizations, like Forefront, are all over the United States. And we, in each state or region, support grant-making organizations of all shapes and sizes. We also support operating nonprofits, as the Nonprofit Alliance in most states have a similar nonprofit alliance as well. So we work closely with our counterparts in other states through organizations like National Council of Nonprofits and the United Philanthropy Forum, both of which are here today, to help organize around policy issues at the federal level. And trade notes on best practices at the state level. So part of the work of PSOs typically includes public policy. And in our case, we're running that program on behalf of both operating nonprofits and philanthropy. And we, at the state level, have many partnerships with organizations that are shown on this slide. And we all work together on common interests where there's proposals that affect the entire nonprofit sector. But policy, as you know, is just one aspect of what Forefront does. We have a lot of other programs and supports available to grant makers, including our Grant Making Institute, which is coming up this spring. So if you'd like more information on that, please let us know. And I'll put in chat shortly a link to our next member orientation for those that might want to send new staff to that to learn more, or if you're not a member and you're interested in exploring that. We also, in response to all of the federal activity in the recent weeks, have launched weekly member briefings. And those are limited to members primarily because we're not boarding them and we want folks to be able to speak freely and ask questions in this kind of anxious environment. Tomorrow, that briefing features Governor Grace Ho and her assistant, Brian Croak. And we're gonna ask them to help us understand how the state is responding to all of the federal executive orders. So it's a great opportunity, and I hope you can join us. So a core part of Forefront's commitment related to public policy is educating stakeholders like yourselves about the rules of engagement in policy and events like this one. So one of our 7 key position statements relates to supporting and defending democratic participation and civic engagement among folks in our sector. And we feel like the defense of democracy should be evergreen work. It shouldn't just be once a decade around the census, for example, but this is really something that we need to be thinking about all the time. So today we're focused on making sure you all know how to engage in the process, and you can learn more about our policy position statements and our current agenda on our website if you would like to take a peek. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Carrie and Maggie, who are the 2 folks from foundations in Illinois that are going to help us look closer at the rules. So I will go ahead and continue to control the slides. Just let me know when you need me to advance.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Holly, and great to be with everybody today. So I'm going to kick us off before turning it over to Carrie as we walk through the federal advocacy rules. And before I begin, Carrie and I are both lawyers, so I want to offer the disclaimer that none of this presentation should be construed as legal advice. It's strictly for educational purposes. So please rely on the information that we provide today strictly in the educational context, and do not consider it to be part of an attorney-client relationship or any other contractual relationship. This information is not a substitute for legal, tax, or other professional advice tailored to your specific circumstances, and should not be relied on for the purposes of avoiding any sort of penalty that may be imposed under the Internal Revenue Code or other governing law, including at the state level. And this is an important and necessary disclaimer anytime a lawyer is presenting in this setting, but especially in this context. These laws are so granular and so fact specific that it really, really is essential, if you have any doubt about the application to your organization, to consult with expert counsel. Knowledge is really power, especially in this current political environment we find ourselves in. So fully endorse contacting an attorney when in doubt. So moving on from there, I just want to walk through quickly what we'll be generally covering. First, as we've already alluded to in the polling portion, there are different rules depending on the type of exempt organization in question. So we'll walk through what those are. We'll talk about the two methods of measuring lobbying under the Internal Revenue Code. We'll look at what some of these rules look like in practice. And finally, we'll walk through permitted activities, exceptions, and some do's and don'ts under this set of rules. So, I think first things first, like I mentioned, there really are significant differences depending on how your organization is classified under 501c3. And so when it comes to partisan political activity, though, that is just strictly prohibited for all C3s. I think a really clear-cut example of this is that no C3 should ever be in a position where it's endorsing a candidate for president, for example. And there are a lot of other examples of what the IRS considers to be partisan political activity. But, I think just broadly keep in mind that if an activity, is inherently political and partisan rather than educational, it is a no-go. Lobbying is more of a gray area, and it does depend on the classification your organization has. Public charities can lobby subject to certain limits that we'll talk about in more detail. But private foundations, can't lobby directly and cannot earmark any funds for lobbying. So it really is essential, if you represent a private foundation, to understand how the lobbying rules apply to you. But, despite the partisan political and lobbying restrictions, it's important to keep in mind that there's an entire world of other ways to get involved in advocacy that is available to 501c3s. So public charities are a bit less encumbered here. Private foundations need to keep in mind certain voter registration rules, but generally, I think a big takeaway from this presentation should be that you do have a lot of power to engage in a democratic process, even outside of the lobbying and partisan political spaces. So moving to the next slide. So as I mentioned, there are a couple ways to measure lobbying. The default for 501c3 public charities is that you can lobby insofar as that lobbying comprises an insubstantial part of your overall activities. And here, insubstantial seems to be around 3 to 5% of an organization's activities. And importantly, activities here is paid and unpaid activities. So it's not 3 to 5% of your budget, it's 3 to 5% of your overall activities. But for organizations that know they are interested in advocacy work, there's also a way to kind of get more clarity and more flexibility here, and that's by filing a 501H election. And the benefit of filing this election is essentially that an organization has added comfort that lobbying won't jeopardize its tax-exempt status, so long as any lobbying expenditures don't exceed a certain, very clearly defined threshold that is determined by that organization's overall budget. So, I think for organizations that really know that they have, a big focus in this area, 501H can provide a lot of flexibility, and it's an important tool to keep in mind. So moving on, the definitions of lobbying vary slightly depending on which lobbying definition applies to you. So for insubstantial part, essentially lobbying comprises of advocating for the adoption or rejection of legislation. More specifically, that includes contacting legislators to propose, support, or oppose legislation or the government's budget process, but it also includes urging the public to do the same. So it's broader than maybe what colloquially comes to mind when thinking about lobbying, and that even urging the public to get directly involved in the legislative process is also construed as lobbying in this case. It's slightly different for 501H. So for 501H, the definitions are more clear-cut in my opinion. So there are two types of lobbying under this framework. There's direct lobbying and there's grassroots lobbying. Both involve communication that expresses a view about specific legislation, but for direct lobbying, we're really looking at an organization's contact directly with legislators. Whereas for grassroots, it's the same context of contacting the general public with a call to action to engage directly with their legislators on a specific piece of legislation. So the next slide really, I think, succinctly breaks down what some of these differences look like depending on your tax classification. So I think the real takeaway here is that, the way the IRS seems to think about it is that there's kind of an inverse relationship between your tax favorability under the code and the amount of political or advocacy activity you're able to do. So, 501c3s and especially private foundations are very, very restricted in what they're able to do regarding lobbying and electoral activities, whereas 501c4s, which are less tax favorable because contributions aren't tax deductible, can lobby to an unlimited level and can engage in certain electoral activities. So, I think this inverse is kind of key to why these rules fall the way they do. So I think an important conceptual framework to keep in mind. So I think next we're going to move on to what these rules look like in practice. So, as we've already discussed, community foundations and private foundations, the rules don't apply the exact same way. Community foundations, the public charity rules apply. So, their lobbying is allowed subject to certain limits, and those limits depend on whether the default and substantial part test applies or 501H applies. But, lobbying is allowed. And for private foundations, no lobbying, no earmarking funds for lobbying, but there are many ways to get involved in advocacy work outside of that, which we will talk about in more detail on the next slide. So, I think it's important when you're thinking about what foundations are able to do to remember that lobbying is focused on the legislative process specifically. And there's a really wide range of activities outside of the legislative process where 501c3s are able to act without thinking about the ways that the lobbying rules apply. So, a really important exception here is that, once a bill has become a law, it's no longer in the legislative pipeline. So, for example, an organization can work with the executive branch to think about how regulations might be drafted or how the law might be implemented. Similarly, executive orders, I'm sure, are top of mind for everybody right now, given the slew we've had over the past month or so. And since executive orders do come from the executive branch, they are not a legislative process, and speaking against or for any executive order is not considered lobbying. There are also other tools that are really important, like training grantees. So if you're a private foundation and you can't lobby, that doesn't mean that you can't train your grantees on what they're legally allowed to do. And of course, that doesn't mean you should tell your grantees to lobby on your behalf, because that would fall within the private foundation lobbying prohibition. But, public charities do have more flexibility here, and, all of our grantees should know their rights. So training is essential. And similarly, funding litigation, that's a judicial function, not a legislative function. So, foundations are fully able to get involved there. And the other items on this list are also tools at your disposal. So in addition to the ways to advocate that fall outside of lobbying, the IRS has also carved out some lobbying exceptions where essentially, these might be considered lobbying in a vacuum, but the IRS has explicitly said that they do not consider them to be lobbying. So one example of this is nonpartisan analysis or research. So, if an organization were to publish a paper talking about, the facts surrounding climate change, and the details of that paper were to inform the way that a congressperson thinks about a potential law, that is, as long as, the legislation in question isn't part of the analysis, that's nonpartisan analysis, essentially. So it's not considered lobbying. Similarly, if the government reaches out to your organization and requests your technical assistance in thinking about a law, that's essentially a hall pass to engage in ways that you might not otherwise be able to engage unsolicited. Similarly, broadly examining or discussing societal issues is not considered lobbying. And, a really important exception, especially right now, is the self-defense exception. In some regards, the self-defense exception is pretty narrow because it touches to, the core functions of tax-exempt organizations rather than their programmatic activities. So, but essentially that means that an organization can lobby against or for a bill so long as that bill specifically touches to the organization's existence, powers, duties, tax-exempt status, or deductibility of contributions. And this is top of mind right now, I know, for a lot of organizations in this space, because last cycle, HB 9495 was, on the docket, and it raises some concerns that really do cut to the core of how 501c3s operate. So, self-defense is maybe more top of mind this fall than it might have been, a few years ago. But I'm sure Holly and the team have much more detail for you there than I will provide here. So I think that's it for these slides. I'm going to turn it over to Carrie to talk us through some do's and don'ts. Thanks.
Before we move on, I just wanted to point out the question in chat, if one of you could tackle that, about whether requests for technical assistance must be in writing. And then Carrie, go ahead. Thanks.
Maggie, I don't know if you wanted to chime in on that or not.
Sorry, I was reorienting my screen, so I'm a little.
No worries, no worries. There's
a
a question in the chat about whether requests for technical assistance need to be in writing. Our approach is we always try to have it in writing just to make sure, because you want to be extra careful. So it's always best to have it in writing if you can, just so that you don't end up in a situation where there's any doubt about whether there's a request. So I definitely would say that's a best practice.
I completely agree, and thanks for fielding that, Carrie, while I got resituated.
No worries, no
yeah,
worries.
yeah.
Holly, can you? Sorry, go ahead.
I was just say, yeah, I think it's definitely burden of proof is something to keep in mind here, as in, all of this just to make sure that you have what you need if worst case scenario happens and someone questions what you're doing.
Absolutely. And honestly, in this day and age, making sure that you're understanding the rules and keeping clear records is really important when when the field is under scrutiny. So I'd say that's always the best practice is, know the rules, make sure you're following them, have good documentation. So moving into some of the additional pieces of the federal rules, Maggie mentioned several times the word nonpartisan, and sometimes that can be confusing about what's included and what's not. So we wanted to share some specific do's and don'ts to help understand what's allowed and what's not, because we certainly want to encourage folks to be involved in advocacy for groups that are allowed to do lobbying to make sure that you're able to follow the rules or for any sort of voter engagement that you're supporting as well. And the do's and don'ts here on the screen really lay out the most important things. The number one rule that all 501c3s must follow is to remain nonpartisan. And that means that nonprofits and foundations cannot say or do anything that suggests support or opposition of a candidate, of a slate of candidates running for public office, or for or against a political party. And just to be clear, that applies to any candidate for public office, whether it's local, state, or federal government, and even if the office itself is considered nonpartisan, like judges. It also applies if the candidate is running as an independent and not affiliated with any particular party. So you can certainly engage, do all those things Maggie just described. Just make sure that you're being very clear to stay in that nonpartisan lane. Next slide. We also want to take a minute to talk about voter engagement, because this is a key complement to advocacy work, because we want the public to make sure that they are fully empowered to exercise their voice, and part of using their voice is voter engagement. And it's really important for nonprofits to be engaged here for a couple of reasons. First, because campaigns are very often the key mechanism through which voters are contacted and encouraged to vote. But the problem here with campaigns is that they're not long term. They're not constantly based in community and doing that engagement. They're formed with a clear end goal to elect someone. And once that person is elected, the campaigns often disappear and don't re-engage voters. And because they need to be efficient with their resources, campaigns tend to focus on only contacting likely voters or regular voters, those who voted in the past. And that leads to this cycle you see on the slide, where if you're a first-time voter or an infrequent voter, the campaign's not really incentivized to reach out. And if the campaign doesn't reach out and the person doesn't vote, then they get into this cycle that they're labeled unlikely. And if we see this continue to repeat. And this negative feedback loop has real consequences because it reinforces the inequities that frankly plague so many of our social challenges. But there's also the opportunity here, because if we can find ways to reach these potential new voters or infrequent voters, there's ample evidence that once someone has voted, it puts them in a much better position to become a lifelong voter. And nonprofits are far more likely to focus on reaching these eligible but not frequent voters that campaigns often overlook. And that in turn gives our communities more of a voice in the process and able to get their needs met. So we strongly encourage that. Next slide, please. It's also worth noting, unfortunately, not enough nonprofits are actually doing voter engagement, despite it being important. And it's not just nonprofits, it's also philanthropy. There really aren't enough funders that are investing in this nonpartisan voter engagement. Less than 1% of philanthropic dollars support voter engagement activities. And I would love to see that increase, because we really need to make sure that we're leveraging all the influence that we know nonprofits have to encourage people to participate in their communities. And this work is severely under-resourced, and at a time when barriers to voting are rising, I'd really strongly encourage all of you. This support is deeply needed, and you can certainly do it within the nonpartisan framework we just described. And I'm going to hand it back to Holly for the next piece.
Thanks, Carrie. I'm also toggling. So we want to spend just a couple minutes going over the specific Illinois and local rules in Illinois, which vary among states. So just a quick snapshot for you, because we think foundations really need to understand these rules, even if your foundation does not engage in lobbying activity, because many of your grantees do. And the rules and related expenses and administrative burdens, reporting requirements are very likely affecting many of your grantees. And so we want to make sure nonprofits know they have to comply with the federal rules that Maggie covered, but also the state requirements, and within Illinois, the also unique city of Chicago requirements, which has its own system. So we have very detailed information about the state and local rules on our website, which I'll pop into chat. Bear with me. It's hard to copy and paste and talk at the same time. So I'll put that in chat shortly. So for states, the lobbying regulations really are intended to be sunshine or transparency laws. So states want to be able to follow money and how money is influencing outcome. So unlike the IRS, the state of Illinois doesn't care how much lobbying you do necessarily, but whether you do it at all. So if you do any lobbying in Illinois at the state or local level, you may need to register as a lobbyist with the Illinois Secretary of State, which is different than at the federal level, where they're mostly tracking how much of your activities and time are related to lobbying. And as long as you don't exceed those limits, you're not registering. So Illinois, in comparison to other states, has relatively strict lobbying laws. There isn't a lot of leeway, and folks are real close attention, because when you're out of compliance, the fines can rack up quickly. But it is manageable and it can be learned, and we're happy to help when you have questions. So the key test in Illinois is whether you're speaking on behalf of a third party, like your employer, and whether you are being compensated or reimbursed for doing so. So most volunteers, union members, board members at nonprofits would not have to register because they're most often not compensated. In the case where a board is compensated, a board member is compensated and they engage in what the state defines as lobbying, that would be different. But most board members are volunteers, so they would not have to register. So the test is whether you have paid staff engaging in what the state defines as lobbying. And if so, their salary counts as payments for lobbying. So each individual that's paid for lobbying would have to register in addition to the entity itself. In Chicago, it's a little different. So the state laws specifically carve out the city of Chicago when folks are lobbying the city of Chicago. So the city of Chicago manages its own system for registration and reporting when folks are lobbying the city itself. So in Chicago, for folks that lobby the city, thresholds apply as of July 1st of last year. So Forefront was involved in renegotiating these rules, and they're newly effective, and so we want to make sure folks are aware of them. So you have to spend a certain amount of time or a certain amount of money in Chicago before you have to register, and they specifically exempt volunteers and nonprofits that have either 5 million or less in assets or 5 million or less in expenses based on the two related lines on your most recent 990. And there's also other exceptions that are specifically carved out. And Chicago waives the fee for registrants if you're a 501c3 or C4. So those rules are very different than the states. So when you have questions, we're happy to help you understand the difference, because we know in many cases folks are registering in both places, and it can get confusing. So here's a quick shot, just a snapshot of the differences between the two regulatory bodies. And when you have questions about how any of this works, you can reach out. And I also want to know we do a training for operating nonprofits on these rules. It's a very deep dive into this every fall. So keep an eye on that in Forefront's communications, and that way you can refer your grantees and partners to that training that's geared towards operating nonprofits that are more heavily involved in lobbying to make sure they understand the rules. I just want to kind of quickly, before I hand it back to our panel, stress what's highlighted here, which with all of this in mind, everything that we've just covered, part of why Forefront really exists is to help represent the sector, including folks that cannot themselves directly lobby. That's why we have a policy team. So we're here for you, and we want you to engage with us so we understand what you're seeing in your communities, what patterns you're seeing with your grantees, so that we can help then convey that information when needed to elected officials if you're not allowed to operate in that space. We also want to encourage you to understand the basics here so you understand the administrative and reporting burden that your grantees are struggling with, so that you can be mindful of that when you're thinking about ways to support them, because it does require some infrastructure and capacity that's unique compared to other types of programming. So with that, I'm going to hand it back. Carrie and Maggie, you're going to help lay out the tracking and reporting quickly, which is a short piece, and then go into what this actually looks like at Joyce Foundation to help you understand how a foundation that's private is like boldly in the advocacy space, so you can imagine what that might look like for you. Thanks, Carrie.
Thanks so much, Holly. So as Holly noted and as Maggie noted, there are a bunch of rules we need to follow. And to make sure that we're staying in compliance with those rules, tracking and reporting are really key to making sure that you're staying within those bounds. Next slide, please. First thing I want to note is just the importance of planning ahead. You want to make sure that you're making a plan if you're going to be engaging in any sort of advocacy, and especially if you're going to be engaging in any sort of lobbying, make sure you're keeping track of your activities. And this is especially important because you want to keep your lobbying below that limit that Maggie described, whether you're using the insubstantial part test that's 3 to 5%, or a more clear and distinct formula under the 501H election, you want to make sure you're complying with whichever bucket you're in. And you can't do that unless you're keeping track of your activity. You want to make sure that you're doing that on a regular basis. It's really hard to go back in time at the end of the year and add this all up. So keeping a regular record helps. When I was the executive director of a nonprofit, my approach was simply to keep a log each week. I would add up what lobbying activity we did that week so that I knew how much we were doing and could make sure we were staying within those boundaries. And for grantees of yours that are thinking about this, if they're debating whether they should stay as just a C3 or if they want to add a C4, keeping track of the amount of lobbying can be really helpful to know if you've hit that threshold where maybe it's advisable to have a C4 to be able to do unlimited lobbying activity. Now, in terms of funders on this, only, as we noted before, only community foundations can be doing lobbying. Private foundations should not be doing lobbying except for that self-defense exception. So that means you really wouldn't need to be tracking. But we also want to make sure that we're encouraging our grantees to do this ahead. And as I noted, make sure that you're keeping regular contemporaneous records, plan ahead to have that, understand what your filing requirements and deadlines are under federal, state, and local law, and put it in your calendar so there's no chance you can miss this, that it's a lot easier to stay ahead of it than to get behind on it. Next slide, please. And when you're doing this, all of you who've done any sort of accounting are going to recognize this form. So nonprofits have to file a 990 annually with the IRS. This is true for us in foundation land as well. And it's Schedule C is the form where you're going to be reporting that lobbying activity that you're engaged in. And I believe that we're going to drop the link in the chat so that that's easy to find. And then next,
It's in there.
awesome, thanks, Holly. If we could move to the next slide. We understand, we just threw a whole lot of rules at you in a very short amount of time. And that can be, you can have a little bit of anxiety about, okay, what does this mean we can actually do? And that's part of why I'm here, because the Joyce Foundation, we are a private foundation, so we are under the strictest rules by the IRS. And yet our foundation is primarily focused on policy work. All of that is happening within those safe zones that Maggie described. So we wanted to kind of give you a snapshot, some examples of what this actually looks like for how much we can do. Next slide, please. So policy work is actually much broader than people realize. Most people, when they hear policy work, all they think of is lobbying, and it's really so much more. At Joyce, we like to think of this as a spectrum, and this is what we use for our grant making. We look at the spectrum of policy work. It starts with the building blocks and research to develop good policy ideas. Then it moves into growing support to lead to policy adoption. But then your work isn't done once a policy is adopted. Supporting implementation is key to make sure that new policy actually comes to life. And then finally, we want to evaluate the effectiveness of these policies. We want to track the impact, and we want to share best practices. So as you can see, there's a lot of work here that's short of lobbying that we can do. And we want to walk through just a couple of examples under each of those. So next slide, thanks. So the building blocks of good policy, where we start, that can include a variety of things. That can include research to better understand an issue and to develop policy solutions. So for example, some of the political violence work that we have started exploring a few years ago, this was a new area for us, and we invested in public opinion research to better understand how the public perceived the problem and to gauge support for possible solutions to it. So that this way we were really trying to identify where there might be traction to institute some new policy. All of that was safely C3 because it wasn't even at legislation yet. This was simply coming up with what are good policy solutions. Next slide, please. So the next step then is growing support for policy adoption. You found developed what these good policy ideas are. Now they need to gain traction. And this includes public education about the issue, public education about what possible solutions might be, coalition building to help grow community support for something, as well as advocacy that falls short of that lobbying. So basically, this is everything that's not lobbying: public education engagement, publishing reports, hosting briefings, working with the press, holding convenings. There's really a lot that you can do in this policy advocacy space that's in that broader space up until the line you get to lobbying. Next slide, please. But then a lot of folks, after they pass a new policy, they kind of give themselves a pat on the back and go home. Wrong answer. Your work isn't done because policy has been adopted. Supporting implementation is really key to make sure that that new policy lives up to its full potential and is fully implemented. And we have a few examples here of what that could look like. One is technical assistance. So there's a new policy that's been adopted, charging a state agency with implementing a new program. Well, if a state agency is doing something entirely new, they may need some technical assistance from outside experts to help them shape and design what that implementation is going to look like and to put in place the tools that they need to do that. Advocates and funders can also then be monitoring and reporting on progress. So, okay, the state set up this new program. Is it working? Let's look at what it looks like in the first year. Let's look at what the changes are. Let's make sure the public who benefits from that program knows about it. Do some public education, and then also have some accountability. So if the state or county or whomever isn't fully implementing this, having some accountability to ask why and see what solutions are needed to make that happen. And sometimes in worst case scenarios, that might even require litigation if you have a government entity simply refusing to follow the law. And all of this implementation work is within that safe zone because we're not talking about legislation because it's already become a law at that stage. Next slide, please. And then finally, we want to understand the effectiveness of these policy efforts, good, bad, and mixed, to inform future work. So we want to evaluate and assess what worked, what didn't, want to report on that, perhaps issue recommendations for ways to improve it in the future, protect and defend it against erosion, and then share those best practices out so that others can emulate them. Next slide, please. Which brings us back to the full picture here of this entire policy spectrum of all the policy and advocacy work that foundations can and should support, even if, like us at Joyce, you're in this private foundation category that can't engage in lobbying. There's really still a whole bunch of advocacy that you can safely do, and we encourage you to do that. Next slide, please. All right, so we see the importance of engaging in advocacy, but how do funders and nonprofits actually structure our grant making to stay within these rules? There are a couple of main tools that we use at Joyce for how we're thinking about this work. The first is the option you have is just providing general support grants. So if you have grantees that are doing advocacy work, even if you have grantees that are doing lobbying work, it's safe to fund groups that also do lobbying as long as you've have your grant making set up so that you're not explicitly funding that lobbying work. General support grants are a great way to do that. Be careful, you can't earmark funds for lobbying in the grant award letter and communication, so it can't be like a wink, wink. No, we're not going to say this. Don't say you get in trouble. But if you're just putting out a general support grant to support an organization's general operations, you like the work that they're doing, some of it might be lobbying, but that's not what you're aiming to fund. It's their work broadly. That's one of these legal safe harbors. General operating grants are fantastic for supporting groups that are doing important work. The other option is what's called the project grant rule. And with this is you're designing a grant to support the everything but lobbying. You can either have an allocated budget as part of your grant proposal that's showing all the non-lobbying work that's being supported, or just simply not earmarking funds for lobbying and then have assurance in the budget and the grant documents that the foundation portion of the funded work is smaller than the lobbying. So if an organization has an $800,000 project budget, 200,000 of that is lobbying, 600,000 is not, and you're making a $400,000 grant, and it says foundation funds won't be used for lobbying, then you're covering your bases because you're using that project grant rule. And it's really important, lastly, to make sure that you're providing training for your nonprofit grantees as well as for your foundation staff. We always like to see that the grantees we're funding in this space have a fluency with the laws that are applicable to them and that foundation staff does as well. It makes us more confident that our funding is going to be applied appropriately, especially since this does involve tracking and accounting. And the one last piece here I want to make sure to stress is that really understanding these rules is actually empowering because it enables funders and our grantees to maximize the amount of advocacy and voter engagement that we're allowed to legally do and that we're allowed to legally fund. And ultimately, that empowers our communities. So I will wrap there. Maggie, is there anything you wanted to add about how your foundation approaches this?
I completely second everything you said, Carrie. I think the GNOP versus lobbying budget versus making sure none of our funds are earmarking distinction is really important to how we, make our grants. And I also do want to reemphasize the point that, it seems in a lot of ways like everything is on fire right now. So, I understand the urge to only focus on the active fires, but I think that there is so much value in really focusing on the ways that these laws impact you, because it ultimately gives you more power to put out the fires if you devote that time. So fluency is really key here.
Absolutely.
We have several questions in chat, so I'll read them so you can collect your thoughts. If a policy has already been enacted into law but hasn't received funding through the appropriations process yet, would advocacy efforts to secure that funding be considered direct lobbying? And then there's a specific example, and I can tackle that one if Carrie and Maggie can.
Sure. The lobbying rules that were mentioned earlier in the presentation, it's about legislation. It's also the budget process. So you do need to be careful about that. You don't want to be funding activity that's advocating directly for that funding, because that crosses into the lobbying. However, as we just said, if you have a grantee that's working on that and you're funding the non-lobbying portion of their work, it's fine if they're also lobbying on that. You just have to make sure your grants are structured safely.
Yeah, and if a operating nonprofit is lobbying or advocating for a funding item in the state budget, that would be defined as lobbying by the state. So that operating nonprofit might need to register in order to engage in that work. The next question is, can you clarify if there's a specific percent a nonprofit can use of a GenOps grant for lobbying, assuming you aren't the only funder and it's not the same amount as your grant? So of a general operating grant that a private foundation makes, when it's mixed with other funders' general operating grants, is there a certain percentage of that grant that can be used for lobbying or policy work, I should say?
So I'll jump in here and say that the way we think about it at MacArthur, at least, is that when we make general operating grants, we don't like our grantees tracking how our funds are used at all. So essentially the money is going into a large unallocated pool, and the grantees have the discretion at that point to use our funds toward any of their operations as they deem appropriate, alongside all the other unrestricted funds they've received. So typically we don't, or, when structured correctly, we don't have the insight into how our specific dollars are being spent. So it really puts the onus on grantees to ensure that they're abiding by the lobbying rules that apply to them, whether that's the insubstantial part test or 501H. So I think that's a helpful way to kind of frame it, that like for GenOps, you really, in most cases, shouldn't have the direct insight into how your specific dollars are being apportioned, at least in my opinion. And that's how MacArthur does it.
Yeah, and Mary, if you want to chime in with follow-up to clarify anything, please do, just to make sure we're answering your question. There's follow-up comments in chat that they thought there was a 20% cap.
Well, the whole purpose of a general operating grant is that it's unrestricted funds at that point.
Right.
So you're making the grant to the organization. That organization is still going to have to follow its rules, as Maggie noted, whether it's insubstantial part or 501H, depending on their activity. But if you're giving a general operating grant, then they can use that as unrestricted funds. The important thing to note is just no earmarking of funds. So you can't be earmarking it for lobbying.
Helpful, guys. I just think about we fund a lot of very small organizations, right? They're not significantly large that receive multiple grants. So, but I really appreciate the framing, Maggie and Carrie, that you guys gave. It is interesting, Vanessa, you were thinking about it too. I thought there was some rule. That way I can just like at least advise the nonprofits that we work with, but GenOps is always the best, period, full stop.
Yeah, no, that the reason why I asked that, because that is something, like, as someone who works for nonprofits and also has a nonprofit and work for a nonprofit in Illinois as a consultant here in DC, that is something that the 20% is always being thrown around as like that is the, that's what you have to make sure that you're following below. So it was very interesting to, kind of hear your thoughts on that. So thank you.
Yeah, and I would stress, especially in the current moment, very few, if any, nonprofits will ever not appreciate a Gen Op grant. So it's kind of like the golden goose or whatever. But so it's an advantage in most cases to structure it that way, regardless of whether or not the organization is doing advocacy work. And on your question about funding travel to DC, for example, at the federal level, the definition of lobbying requires contact on specific legislation and taking specific action on that legislation with an official. So if they're not doing specifically that, it wouldn't be considered lobbying at the federal level. And so it depends on how they're spending their time in DC, if that would be considered lobbying activity. In some cases, folks are going to demonstrations or other events, so it kind of depends. And I would invite Carrie or Maggie to comment further on that in terms of the grant making aspect to make sure I'm not getting it wrong.
Yeah, and I'll give you a little clarification. So for instance, the National Coalition of Cancer Survivorship, they hold a large Hill Day, and nonprofits and individual advocates come to that Hill Day. One of the things that some other nonprofits do is help to cover the costs of some of these advocates or individuals with lived experience to participate in going to, directly visit with lawmakers. And so I think that is the area that I'm wondering about. If you're paying someone, if you're helping to cover the cost of someone to come here to participate in a Hill Day, and they will be going to meet with lawmakers, even though they're doing it through another organization, you're still funding that, correct? That makes sense.
It makes sense. The approach that I've used is, I mean, part of this is you have to be really thoughtful about what you're putting in the grant materials. So in the grant proposal, in the award letter, in the grant reports, if you have a grantee that's saying we're going to do a lobby day, then that bright red light goes off that it's like, okay, that's lobbying activity. We shouldn't be supporting that. Are there other things we can fund? So if we're doing a project grant, then, we're either looking for an allocated budget or having something that clearly says that foundation funds are not going to be used for that lobbying activity. And if it's being labeled as a lobby day, then the presumption is that's going to be lobbying activity. So just to be extra cautious, I will exclude that if it's a project grant. If it's a Gen Op grant, as we were just talking, then those are unrestricted funds. And since a nonprofit, whether it's a insubstantial part or a 501h, they have to follow percentages of how much lobbying they're doing and how much non-lobbying to have their C3 status. Then if we're doing the Gen Ops grant, then there's clearly enough activity that's in that non-lobbying that we're okay. That's just how we've approached it. I always tend to err, maybe it's the lawyer in me, I try to err on the side of caution. If they're labeling it a lobby day, I'm like, okay, the presumption is going to be against us here, so it's safer not to do that, but there are usually lots of other things that we can do. So like we can fund training, so
Right.
compliance training. We can, make sure that folks have other tools. And then how they use those tools are up to them. But there's a lot that we can do that's still in that safe zone.
Got
And so grantees should not use the word lobby in their report, or their grant applications or reporting for these general op grants, but there's essentially no difference between supporting an organization that lobbies at the federal or state level. So if they're doing it at the state, in terms of the grant making rules, it's no different. And I wanted to pause. Matthew has something to add here on the 20% thing and the confusion around that. So Matthew, please do. And then for the sake of time, we're going to have to transition into our FOTH training. So we'll be wrapping up this portion shortly. Go ahead, Matthew.
Sure. Just quickly, I think Carrie made a good point. For the C3s, the 20% only applies. It's called the Lobbying Disclosure Act. So if you're a C3, The 20% applies to the amount of time that you spend on lobbying activities as it relates to sort of your lobbying expenses. And so it has nothing to do with grants at all. And I would echo those sentiments, using a general operating grant for any, not when I say use it, I'm just saying general operating grants are better than any other grant when it comes to advocacy activities. So just wanted to highlight that 20% is really from the Lobbying Disclosure Act as it relates to C3s and their reporting. So just wanted to clear that up.
Thank you. I know folks may need to step out, but you're welcome to stay. We have an evaluation in chat, and I put resources in chat. There's a few links there. The lobby rules page, our events page, and I wanted to highlight again our new weekly member briefings that require a login to our website. So if you want to attend the one with Grace Ho tomorrow, please proactively work on that today to make sure you don't have any login issues, and reach out to Emily and our program team if you need support with that. Finally, if you want to follow our work, there's nothing that requires or prevents you from following action alerts on what Forefront's doing in the policy space and reading information. So please sign up to receive those alerts. And for those that want to learn more about FOF, there's the landing page in chat. You can read more about FOF and consider joining us next year if you weren't able to go this year. And we're going to transition into that portion of the program now. So I just want to say thank you so much to Carrie and Maggie. I understand you may need to step out as well. We really appreciate your time and expertise. And if there are any other follow-up questions, I'll work with Carrie and Maggie to help answer those after this meeting. Please feel free to reach out anytime about these rules. So with that, we're going to transition now to our FOF training. First and foremost, I just wanted to show you, very importantly, our traditional elevator photos. The crowded elevator, it's the highlight of FOF, as you'll learn when you join us. It's always a lot of fun. So I just want to quickly go through some logistics, and then I would like to spend a few minutes discussing some of the dynamics that are unique this year and how we're going to handle these meetings. And that's why Jessica and Matthew are here, because they can help answer questions you may have that are causing anxiety, or give us some do's and don'ts and guidance for how to engage on the Hill when we go. So just quickly, here's a snapshot of the schedule. So many folks are arriving Sunday or even Saturday night for the pre-conference, which is optional. But last year I was late to that and deeply regretted it. So I made it a point to attend this year. So if you're in town and able to go, I would recommend it. It was really well done last year. Monday is the full day conference where you'll be in a room with hundreds of your colleagues from around the United States. And they will spend a lot of time prepping us for the Hill meetings and talking about this moment in philanthropy and how philanthropy should be engaging in policy work. And as a reminder, our delegation includes, and the same is true in other states, includes all types of grant makers. So in some cases that includes operating nonprofits that pass through funds to other operating nonprofits. So not everybody in the room will be traditional foundations. It's a wide variety of players in the sector that are making funding decisions. And so it's a great chance to network and connect. If you're a community foundation, you'll be able to meet folks from around the country running community foundations and vice versa. Tuesday and Wednesday are when we do the Hill visits. Some folks in the delegation are leaving Tuesday night. That's okay, that happens every year. So we're gonna assign meetings and prioritize meetings based on folks' availability to meet with their own representatives to the greatest extent possible, but we don't have total control over the schedule. We'll be using ride shares to and from the conference hotel for those meetings. The forum puts together Uber credits or Lyft credits for us, which is really helpful. So we'll kind of meet in the lobby and pile in cars and go and try to stay together as much as possible. And we'll try to make it real easy for you. Tuesday night, for those that are still in town, Forefront's hosting a dinner at a restaurant called The Smith. It's the time here is wrong. It's actually a 7. I apologize. That was Central Time. So if folks know In some cases, folks have other business or plans in DC, which is fine. So if you know you cannot attend that dinner Tuesday night, I already know the folks that are leaving early so that you don't have to worry about that. But if you know you're going to be in town but not attend the dinner, if you could let us know, that would be really helpful so we can give the host site a final head count. So you can just ping me via email for that. So quickly, we want to just go over the key issues that the whole FOTH, all of the groups attending FOTH are organizing around this year. So it is really important to stay on message and have a unified voice on the Hill. We've got hundreds of folks from philanthropy going to the Hill on the same days. And to break through the noise, we try to have a unified voice and a shared agenda. But there is some room for each state to work in unique state issues. But we start with this unified agenda. So we can't cover every issue. There's no way. Most of these meetings are 15 to 30 minutes. So we have to be very focused. And right now there's a lot of very fundamental threats to our sector, as you all know. And so it's even more important to stay really focused on our larger role in the congressional districts and the value we bring. And to highlight, when we talk to officials, your constituents are our constituents too. The people that vote for you are the people we're serving and making grants to help them understand it's one and the same, and what matters to them in terms of their voters matters to us and vice versa. So if you all have data about the grant making that you do in the district, that would be very helpful to have in hand for meetings. So the number of nonprofits you support, the amount of dollars you distribute every year, things like that that convey the value, anything that supports the idea that we are a big part of the workforce and that your grant making supports jobs and economic impact in the community would be helpful. So I would ask you to kind of organize some of those things and bring it with you. And also, if you're seeing declining giving, that would be really important information to bring. So if you have fewer donors, fewer dollars, or your grantees have fewer donors or fewer dollars because we're lacking a non-itemizer deduction right now, that would be very helpful. So I'm going to pause and invite Matthew and Jessica both to chime in on anything you want to add on this note of like the shared kind of key messages.
I could start and then Matthew can just chime in with that. So when it comes to health days, it's really helpful to mention that there are other states and there are other organizations meeting with different offices, especially if you're meeting with an office that happens to be in a very influential committee like Ways and Means, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. So if you hint that there are other conversations happening around this topic, especially the concerns, it prompts the staff and the elected official to have those conversations with each other and to follow up with that. So it lets them know that there are other people sharing the same challenge, concern, solution, and conversation. So it makes it all the more important to have that. And it's okay if the answer is, I don't know, or I will follow up with you, because it's really important to have that opportunity to follow up with whether it's a staff or the elected official.
Jessica, do you want to mention your sign-on letter quickly, and then we'll ask Matthew to chime in?
Yes.
I put it in the chat.
Oh, thanks, Hal. So part of that unified message is that we launched a letter back at the beginning of the year just to kind of let Congress know that there are so many nonprofits around the country providing a lot of services that range in all shapes and forms. And so there are a lot of conversations happening that will affect not just nonprofits, but individuals around the country when it comes to the tax debate, the budget. Now we're seeing a lot of pushback around the work that nonprofits do through executive orders. So with so many things happening, just finding one key solution is that nonprofits are coming together to send a very clear message that we are very active partners. We want to have these conversations. Please just be mindful of the consequences that can happen when you leave nonprofits out of the conversation. So that sign-on letter is getting a lot of traction recently. So we went from maybe 2,000 to now we're pretty close to 5,000. And thanks to everyone in Illinois who signed, now we have well over 100 signatures. So you will have that for Foundations on the Hill, and you will show that there are so many nonprofits in the state that are very engaged and very active partners. So that number, it says a lot of good things. So hopefully offices are very receptive to that. So thanks, Forefront, and everyone who signed on to it and for sharing it. And the deadline is this Friday.
Yeah, it's tomorrow. So yes, Michelle, to your question, please do share it with operating nonprofits that want to sign on. That would be very helpful. Matthew, do you want to add anything on just the key messages?
Absolutely. Thank you, Holly. So again, my name is Matthew L. Evans. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy and External Relations for United Philanthropy Forum. We're proud to have Forefront as a member of the forum. The forum is the largest, most diverse network in American philanthropy, with nearly 100 PSOs like Forefront, representing over 7,000 funders and foundations across the country. This is the 22nd Foundations on the Hill. It is the largest and premier advocacy convening for the philanthropic sector. And we're happy to have our nonprofit partners join us as well. I did want to highlight that we do have programming, of course, because it's a full conference, we have programming starting that Sunday. And if you haven't added on the pre-conference and you will be there Sunday, I encourage you to do so. We'll be tackling a lot of the issues that you see on the screen now, particularly talking about some of the executive orders and the impact of protecting the work of the sector. And on Monday, we'll have a full sort of run of programming dedicated to the idea of collective advocacy, working together with your colleagues from across the country to make to use collaboration to make an impact when going to the Hill with coordinated messaging. And so Holly had talked about sort of the policy priorities in the previous slide. And so just wanted to name specifically in this space, in this moment in time when we're seeing, frankly, attacks and mischaracterizations of the sector. The first priority, if you could go to the previous slide, Holly, is supporting philanthropy's role in strengthening our community. So basically, this is storytelling. You know, you're really talking about the fact that in every community, philanthropy foundations and other grant-making organizations are working to meet the immediate needs while also maintaining commitments to our long-term priorities. So we're sort of beating back the narrative. And I always tell people, if you don't tell your story, someone else will tell it for you. And unfortunately, that's what's happening. And so hearing this call and sort of talking about all the rules, it speaks to, I think, philanthropy's long-term, I think, behind the eight ball, if you will, when it comes to advocacy. The trepidation can no longer be there. We have to step up where there will be consequences to our work, and that means changing how we do our work because folks are making laws that impact our sector. And so any apprehension that folks have, I think is that is sort of a standard of the past. We really have to be forward thinking when we're talking about how we approach advocacy and public policy. So telling your story, ensuring that this ask for priority number one is that the philanthropic sector can continue to play a valuable and important role in supporting vibrant communities and a brighter future for all.
Thanks, Matthew. Go ahead.
No problem. For the second one, just wanted to lift up the Charitable Act. As most of you all know, the Charitable Act has got a lot of traction. It's bipartisan legislation. I got a lot of traction in the last Congress. It has been reintroduced, and some of you may know 2 years ago it was introduced originally at Foundation on the Hill, and so it's been reintroduced this Congress. We're hoping to gain traction, and then the messaging there is reigniting America's generosity by expanding incentives to support charitable giving. Holly mentioned charitable giving is down. Again, we're hearing these narratives come out about philanthropy and the sector, the broader charitable sector, and we need to. So one of those things is beating back those narratives. So the ask here is really central, and I'll lift up to piggyback on what Jessica said. There should be an ask when you go into your meetings. They're usually going to be 15 minutes, no longer than that, and so there should be ABC, boom, the ask. And so the ask here is that the member of Congress, if they haven't already, to support the Bipartisan Charitable Act, which will incentivize millions of Americans to give and support their communities. And if they have already supported the Charitable Act, you just simply thank them and ask them to help lobby help get their colleagues on the bill as well. Sorry, I hope I didn't take up too much time out.
No, that was good. We do need to move on, but I wanted to say, so far in Illinois, Mr. Davis, who's pictured here, with Pam from last year's FOTH, is a sponsor of the Charitable Act, and he has been every session. Yes, he's still in Ways and Means, he's still influential, even though he's in the minority. And yesterday, I actually got an alert that Darren LaHood signed on to the Charitable Act, so that's good. He also did in prior Congresses. So we have strong support in Illinois. We have 3 Ways and Means members, so we have some influence. And Vanessa, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, are you going to have fact sheets or
Yes.
leave behinds? Okay, created.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm about to cover that because I know this is like, we're barely scratching the surface here. So yes, some of that has to come together at the last minute, but we will provide a packet with talking points, fact sheets, maps, itinerary, very detailed everything. So some of that requires last minute collating because the scheduling is always down to the wire, but we will provide all that to you in advance of you traveling. So please watch for that by the end of the week next week. And plan to, if you like hard copies, plan to bring your own because they're long and we won't be printing them because we don't want to waste paper for folks that prefer digital versions. And also they're very heavy for me to put in my suitcase. So we have a very large delegation this year. We have 30 people on the Illinois delegation, which is almost twice what we had last year. Maybe the biggest group we've ever had. And so that's a lot of paper. So here's our schedule right now. I have successfully scheduled meetings with everybody listed here. The others have not responded. That's why they're not here. And that will happen. Some of them won't respond and we won't get meetings. We have, 17 House members and 2 senators, so it's likely we'll miss folks. But we do have some that are, yeah, Mary, you're welcome. I purposely put all the most important members on Tuesday because some folks leave Tuesday. So the Senate meetings are both Tuesday, that because the entire delegation can go to those meetings because they represent our whole state. LaHood, Davis, and Schneider are Ways and Means members, so that's why I prioritize them on Tuesday as well. And then Wednesday, the meetings will start to overlap where everybody will not attend every meeting and some folks will have already traveled home or be unavailable. So it works out just fine. We try to make sure the person on the delegation from the district is the one for sure at their own Congress person's meeting. And then that person will help take a lead role in those meetings because it is very important for them to hear from their constituents. This will continue to evolve and very likely something will change. So that's part of why we wait till the last minute to collate packets and print everything. Things change. But we have received commitments that Senator Duckworth, LaHood, Davis, and Schneider will all attend these meetings in person. Davis is very reliable in that way, and he usually spends like a full hour with us. And so he's just been a huge friend to us. So questions about this?
I would say that with only the Charitable Act having bill numbers, that does give you more flexibility to bring up other issues. So I think it's the only caution is we know that right now there is maybe a call to action to philanthropy to fill in a lot of gaps that we might expect with the budget conversation or things like that. So just finding ways to kind of soften the remaining of the meeting without opening up like different rabbit holes where you can say, things like that. Because I think right now there's might be some overlap for nonprofits and philanthropy and how do we step up or things like that. So I do want to give that caution that some offices, they are very concerned about what's happening. So they will probably ask for stories, but also just know that fine line of, not going down a certain rabbit hole. So just staying on message with the Charitable Act and the overall conversation around nonprofit partnerships.
Yeah, Mary, on your note on Schneider on the HR 9495, we probably need to debrief that prior to the meeting. But that bill has not been reintroduced. It also is very likely not going to pass because it wouldn't be able to clear the Senate. And because it would require 60 votes, it's not a candidate for budget reconciliation. And so we would I've spoken to Schneider's office about that, and they've committed that they will come back to us if it's reintroduced and that they understood there were concerns before that weren't addressed. So I would say we need to be very cautious about that in meetings because it could backfire, and we need to make sure we focus on the things that we can get done and the other things that are actually moving and happening right now. So like, for example, the concerns around the budget frameworks that were introduced in the last like 10 days or so or week have potentially huge implications for Illinois. If they're going to cut the federal share of Medicaid, that's going to have massive impact in our state. And so there's things like that that are happening in real time that we need to prioritize in these conversations. And I'm going to help pull together talking points on some of that in advance, but it's very much a moving target right now. Things are happening very quickly. And so we could be in an entirely new situation by next Friday. Like, so just bear with us while we pull the materials together. And we'll have time on Sunday and Monday before going to the Hill to sit and like go through everything and make sure everybody understands what we're doing. So just try to like bear with us and be patient, because I know folks get nervous, but it'll all come together. For the data points, I would just say like the most recent fiscal year, unless there's like a very obvious pattern of change over like the prior 5-year period, or going back to 2017, which is when when the standard deduction went up and fewer folks started itemizing and being able to tap the charitable deduction. So if you've noticed a big shift in giving since 2017, that would be really helpful data if you can go back that far. And I would say when we say giving's gone down, if that doesn't feel right to you based on your personal experience at your own organization, you're like, well, we have more donors and more money. It's because the places and methods people are using to give have shifted dramatically. And so in some cases, organizations are getting more, but it's being offset by losses elsewhere. So it's very possible, like, for example, if your community foundation has more money, your grantees have less. And so like understanding those patterns is really important, because folks are giving more to DAFs and other things now, rather than directly to charities. Okay. Here's some tips. We'll go quickly through this. We've stressed the need already to be concise and clear. And on number 7, adapting your message is really important when we're talking to members of the different parties. So, for example, Republicans often are intrigued by the fact that the charitable deduction has impacted the ability of houses of worship to raise money. Whereas for Democrats, they might be more concerned about certain operating nonprofits in their district. Not always, but generally speaking, there's things like that where both things are very true, but you adapt based on who you're talking to, whatever the most compelling message will be to ask them to come along and support the bill. So we'll help with that in our talking points. We need to be very careful about avoiding partisan statements. We covered that earlier, which is tricky right now. So if you have questions about what that looks like, we can talk more about that when we're in DC. We'll often get questions, and it's okay to say, I don't know. It's better to say that, and I'll follow up with you, than to tell them something you aren't completely sure is true, especially when you're talking to staff. And actually having a follow-up question to answer for them helps build that relationship. You come home, you pull the data, you send it back, thank you for the meeting. Here's the answer you're looking for. And that allows you to continue the conversation when you're at home, which is a really positive thing. Okay, let's see, what do we have left? Just some quick tips. We have a member of our delegation with a peanut allergy. So I want to highlight that and just ask folks to make sure that person's safe. If you bring, granola bars or candy bars, avoid peanuts or other nuts, please. And then very importantly, wear comfortable shoes. A few years ago, I made the huge mistake of wearing heels and deeply regretted it. There's a lot of walking. The buildings in the Capitol are very large. So even like moving even within the same building between meetings can require a lot of walking. So just dress professionally, but wear shoes that you can walk in a lot. And the days are long, you'll be tired, and we'll try to build in breaks so folks can take care of themselves. But it is a lot of moving and a lot of walking. And we'll help with maps and guiding you around. So I touched on this. I'm going to send you a packet, bring your own hard copy. If you can, on the plane or Sunday night before you go to bed, review those materials so you know what's in there. It'll be a lot, so you don't have to memorize everything, but just familiarize yourself with what's in there. That way you can refer to it as needed throughout the week. And we're going to help coordinate all the follow-up afterwards. So just try to show up as prepared as possible, and be as flexible as possible along the way, because things will evolve. And so I'm going to stop sharing, and we'll get you all these slides. And I understand we're close to time. If folks need to stay after, I can stay after. But does anybody have any questions, or is there any specific, like, really important issue you think we need to cover? We can't go into detail about it right now, but unique Illinois issues that you think we need to talk about at our meetings that I didn't mention.
I just want to say thank you to the council for the legislation that, or the litigation that's occurring. That's like such an understatement right now. But I just really truly want to say thank you, because I know you guys have been burning it, and Holly, you've been burning it too. I'm just impressed that you've gotten so much accomplished right now.
It's been, I'm sure Jessica would agree, unlike anything we've seen in our careers.
Every time I hear it, I feel like I have to take a pause and realize that did happen in the last 2 weeks. But it's reassuring to know that people are following this issue and are very eager to help. And we just want to tell folks that we want your help, but also we also need to take care of each other. So thanks.
Holly, just to clarify, so the last couple of years, we have spent varying amounts of time on issues around DAFs with potential regulations, and then also with, at one time, the ACE Act or whatever that was out there. Since I haven't heard much about that recently, are we thinking like, let's sleeping dogs lie, and since it obviously, with change in administration, the whole regulatory situation is completely different than it was last year at this time. My assumption is we're just letting that be unless we hear some other change. Is that the right read on that? Yeah,
and there's no proposals on the table. I think right now in this current environment, the ACE Act is considered like completely dead. Like, it's not, there's no expectation that it will resurface. And so what we can do is, like, especially at the point where we're wrapping up meetings, say, like, if you ever have questions about DAFs or whatever, we can talk about it. But I just think right now, like, the major concerns around the executive orders are, let me see if I can summarize quickly. I don't know how much you all have followed that, because it's been such a fire hose. Like, if it's not your full-time job, it's almost impossible to keep up. Like, I can't keep up, and I mean, it's just crazy. So NCN has an excellent chart on that. Jessica, maybe you can post that in chat real quick. So they've issued orders that are disrupting funding for environment, immigration, anything they consider DEI, which is poorly and loosely defined, international aid, and on down the list. Like, all these things impact nonprofits in our sector. And despite the freeze of the funding freeze, which NCN successfully achieved through their court case, that's still happening. There are still funding streams that are being disrupted. Additionally, there are executive orders that have directed the Department of Justice to pursue criminal liability, criminal, not civil, criminal liability for large nonprofits and grant makers that are funding those things, specifically DEI. And so we have some, like, very serious existential threats that are, like, have so far transcended, like, the potential damage through DAF regulation that it, so, do you know what I mean? Like, in context. So in advance of the Hill meetings, if you all can touch base with your nonprofits and make sure you want to have your head around like their concerns and what's happening in the community, that would be very helpful, so we can illustrate some of that specifically at the meetings through stories. Like I know in my community, there was a small nonprofit with like 4 or 5 staff that lost $1 million of funding for environmental interventions, like overnight, and they were able to successfully restore it after 2 weeks of like panic and lobbying and like all, I mean, it was all over the news. It was crazy. And that kind of stuff's likely to keep happening, where they're going to test every valve, like what can we turn off, and see who has enough capacity and squeaky wheel ability to get their unique programs restored. And then also this like broad effort to turn off major funding streams to programs they have policy disagreements with, and the constitutional questions around that. And the Trump tax cuts from 2017 are scheduled to expire this year. That would have been true regardless of who won the White House. And the price tag of extending those cuts is $4 trillion. And that's part of why they're so aggressively through Doge and other means trying to cut, because they need a way to pay for that. And that stuff's they're gonna have to look, the price tag is so large that they have to look at mandatory spending. So this is part of what came out this week. They've announced that they're gonna cut up to $2 trillion in mandatory spending. So those are things that have previously been considered untouchable. Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, entitlement spending that normally is kind of sacred because the amount of money they need is so large. So these are like very significant things. And the Medicaid cuts, if the federal government share drops below 90%, Illinois has trigger language in our law right now that was passed during, like in response to health reform 10 years ago, that says if the federal share drops below 90%, we automatically cut our expansion program. That's 800,000 people that would be disenrolled from Medicaid in 90 days, unless the state finds funding, and the state doesn't have $4 billion to pay for that if the federal government cuts it. So these are like very, very serious. And like a lot of stuff will probably shake out over the coming days, and we'll know more about where the federal government's headed on the budget. But it's the kind of like changes and damages potentially that are being promulgated are, the word unprecedented has become so trite, but it really is. So I'm sorry that was like a sermon in response to your DAF question, but hopefully that conveys like the gravity of the situation. And if DAF comes up, we'll cover it, but I'm not sure that it is really even on the table right now. I see some comments in chat, so I'm just trying to catch up. Vanessa, is she still here? Oh yeah, so day of, my understanding is that the forum's app will support communication within delegations this year, which is new. They haven't done that before, so I haven't seen it yet, but at our training yesterday, they said that will be the case. So when they roll out that app, you should be getting emails about FOTH. Just make sure you download it, and then we'll figure that out together. In the past, we've created like a group text where we just, but this year we have so many people. We
did a Hilda, and we did a group me, and that worked out really well too. So if anyone wants to do that, it worked out well because then it's not a text message.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. Once I see the app, we'll figure out if it's like user friendly and if we need something else.
And I'm here in DC, and I've spent a lot of time. So if you need help like directing people or meeting people, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, that'll be helpful. It's always helpful to have some veterans on the delegation. So Jessica's posted some helpful information. Any other questions?
I just had a really quick question, because I noted the topics in the survey, Holly, that you sent out that had universal charitable deduction, federal grant reform, postgraduate scholarships, nonprofit representation, and the volunteer mileage reimbursement. Are we gonna address all of these things, or more so kind of like the content that you shared
So yeah, that survey
in this slide?
was put together before a lot of recent events. So what we'll do is talk about those key messages, and then on the second key message, one of the policy responses is the charitable act, and then also we're going to talk about the federal tax and budget package. Within the conversation about the tax package, we can use most of those other things as illustrations of the opportunities that would support the nonprofit sector and people we serve in the tax debate. So like there's proposals like the volunteer mileage proposal, if it was included in the tax package, would be helpful. If the tax treatment for post-graduation scholarships was included, that would be helpful. And that bill, part of the difficulty is those things have not been reintroduced in the new Congress. So it's harder to talk about because we can't be like this, Senate bill XYZ. And so they're more conceptual. So that's part of why, and when we put the survey together, we didn't know that those bills wouldn't be filed yet and so on. So I'll try to lay that out in our like talking points and documents as clearly as possible. And then it's impossible to cover all those issues in short meetings, but we can include information about them in the leave behind packet and follow up. And as things unfold and there's bills introduced down the road, I can follow up and be like, this is the bill we were talking about, So good question.
Okay.
I didn't mean
But
to.
that's helpful. No, thank you.
I also wanted to get a sense from you all, like what you feel is the most important stuff. So like, if some of those feel like that's just not important right now, and let's not spend time on it, I'd rather focus on X, Y, or Z, that's welcome feedback. Most of those are legacy issues from prior years. A lot has changed.
I think it's like what's controllable, right? And like where we might be able to have any type of movement. It's going to be, I just keep looking at what's proactively still occurring and like thanking members for just the work that they're doing still proactively, while also you can tell that they're doing with some reactive stuff, right? So it's like that balance, but funding DEI immigration, right? Just like all of the communities that are under attack and funding. I think that's.
And I heard from Lawrence Benito yesterday. He was saying a lot of folks in his coalition are really nervous about the impact, the double whammy of federal cuts to immigration programs and the state's own budget crisis. I think there's real fear that the federal government's going to whack a lot of things that are important to folks, and then the state won't be able to hold them harmless because the state has serious budget challenges going into this next year. So those are some of the things. I don't know the answers to those questions. It's a really difficult time, and that's part of why we invited Grace Ho to the briefing tomorrow. And I asked her specifically in advance if she can speak to how the state is, to what extent the state can mitigate some of those cuts. And that's not going to be an easy question for her to answer, but I wanted her to know folks are really worried about that. And so we'll see what she has. The governor's budget address is next week, and we'll learn more about where they're headed.
It's the Forefront weekly brief now.
I'm sorry.
Where you said you're inviting Grace, do you mean the newer
It'll be
Forefront?
tomorrow morning.
Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. And just real quick, is there going to be a point you think where our delegation is going to do like a quick little meetup before we go to the meetings? I know we all kind of attend those things anyways, but anything more formal for us all to meet up before we start hitting?
NBC? Yeah, so I need to look at the flight schedule again, but I think everyone's arriving by Sunday night. There may be a couple stragglers Monday morning, but what we'll try to do is, like in prior years, we've just pulled ourselves together in like the plenary ballroom. Like
yeah.
On a break and just like huddled. And so I need to get a handle on the final schedule yet, which the forum is like continuously updating, and we'll find time, but it tends to be pretty ad hoc. So that's why we're like asking for flexibility.
It's
And
all good.
yeah, but we will huddle, and we'll have time Tuesday morning before we go to the Hill to like quickly huddle. The first meeting so far is at 10 a.m. So that should give us time to like have breakfast, talk real quick, and then go. A mini dinner Monday night. I think there's a like 5:30 or 5 to 6:30-ish, like we're hosted
Right.
reception.
That's right. Yeah.
But you don't have to go to that, and you may or may not still want dinner after it, depending on how much food they. So yeah, if folks want to do a dinner, and there's lots of restaurants around the hotel, and I bet Vanessa can recommend some.
Yeah. Yeah, Vanessa.
Yeah. What hotel is everyone staying at?
It's at the JW Marriott.
Oh, yeah. There's tons of places around there. So, and also like if there's a couple of places that are right near the Hill that are good places to meet up. That we've done. There's a and I'll send you a list of them. So if people just say like if they have like a break and they want to go somewhere that's not on the Hill, or that's not one of the cafeterias. And then also I think sometimes choosing one of the cafeterias on either side of the Hill can be a really good option to say, hey, a bunch of people are gonna be meeting on the congressional side in the cafeteria here, and then some other people are gonna be meeting in the cafeteria at Russell at these times. And so that you can all go and meet there at the cafeteria, so you don't have to leave the building, right? So
yeah. Once you leave the building, you have to go back in the security. The lines can be long. We try to build that in. I've tried to cluster meetings in the same building on purpose, which can be challenging, but I've done my best. Michelle asked about security. So yeah, you have to go through security every time you enter a building for the first time. There are tunnels that connect, and it's varied over recent years whether you can travel the tunnels without staff. I think this year we'll be able to, but one year we went and you couldn't. So I don't know if they're
right now you cannot.
okay. So
but that changes daily, right?
yeah, well, and sometimes staff have time to escort you and then
Yeah.
it works, but not always, usually not. So you can bring a water bottle. It's not like an airplane where you can't have fluids in your backpack. So I would encourage you to do that. And there's places to refill them throughout the day. There's cafes in the basements of most buildings. The lines can be long, they can be busy, you don't always get a place to sit. Fox News will be playing on every TV. And,
No bag restrictions.
I'm sorry?
Someone asked if there's bag restrictions. There's no bag restrictions, no. I mean, I wouldn't bring a suitcase, but
Well, sometimes people do because they have to head out to a flight and they don't have time to go back to the hotel or whatever. It just slows you down at security.
yeah, but there's no restrictions.
Yeah. Okay. Any other? Yes, we'll send the slides. Any other questions? You all stayed a long time. You must either be really excited or really terrified.
The above.
Or both.
It's so fun.
I'm just grateful for all of you guys. This is going to be great. I'm glad we're going.
Yeah, it's an important year. Hey, John, good to see your face.
You're on mute, Jen.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
I'm just saying thank you, Holly, for all you've done.
Oh, thanks. You're welcome.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, this is a huge delegation, which is exciting, and more work, but it's encouraging because it tells me folks are like paying attention and understand the importance of this moment, and that's a good thing. I always have this like competition with Michigan because they always have the biggest delegation, and they're killing us again this year because their delegation also doubled. So everyone's fired up. I think they have like 60 people.
Oh
Okay, well,
We'll,
I'm here.
We'll be louder than Michigan.
Yeah. There's issue-based delegations too. So like some of the organizations, like for example, like grant makers in the arts or grant makers concerned with immigrant and refugees, groups like that come as well and will be a part of the whole process. And someone from grant makers concerned with immigrants and refugees is actually joining us for a couple meetings. I'm meeting with her later today to coordinate. So you'll get a chance to meet some of those issue-based advocates as well. It's great. And did you you were connected with the Iowa folks, right?
They know I'm coming, but I haven't heard anything from them. So I think just assume I'll be at your meetings unless she connects.
Yeah, and you can also literally like Monday touch base and be like, what's your schedule? And if you want to opt into any, it's fine. So it can be fluid. The scheduling is always, for those of us that do it, it's always last minute. It's really crazy. I'm sure I'll get emails in the next few days from offices that haven't responded yet, and things will shift. So they're probably in the same boat. Okay, well, we can move along with our days. If y'all need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. I have to go to Springfield for a couple days next week, so if I'm a little slow to respond, that's why, but I'm here. It'll all come together. You probably won't get your packet from me until Friday next week, but it'll be there.
Thank you. So much work. It really is so much work, and so I'm appreciative of being a part of this delegation for the first time, and thank you.
You're welcome. We're happy to have you. So for those that don't know, Vanessa lives in DC, but her organization is headquartered in Chicago, so she's joining our delegation. All right, folks, we'll talk soon. Have a great weekend ahead. Long weekend. Bye.
Thank you, Holly.